Warm greetings from India. I am Nisha Nair, Associate Professor at Jindal Global Law School, and it is my absolute honor to moderate the first panel discussion at the 5-day virtual World University Summit on Universities of the Future, Building Institutional Resilience, Social Responsibility, and Community Impact in G20 countries, jointly organized by the Jindal Global Center for G20 Studies and the International Institute for Higher Education Research and Capacity Building of OP Jindal Global University. It is my pleasure to introduce the distinguished panel of speakers for the first session of the summit on the theme of Navigating the Labyrinth, the University in a World in Polycrisis. We have with us today Mr. Phil Baty. Mr. Baty is the Chief Global Affairs Officer at the Times Education, United Kingdom. Mr. Baty is an authority on international higher education policy and university performance, and he leads on government partnerships and global affairs at Times Higher Education, the trusted data, insights, and consultancy partner to universities, corporates, and governments worldwide. Our next panelist is Professor Marco Borraccetti. He is Associate Professor of European Union Law at Alma Mater Studio Ram Université di Bologna, Italy. Professor Borraccetti is Rector's Delegate for International Agreements and Networks and for University Corridor for Refugees. He is co-director of European Regional Master's Program in Democracy and Human Rights in Southeast Asia, double-titled University of Sarajevo and University of Bologna, and part of Global Campus of Human Rights. We also have with us today our own Professor Vesselin Popovski. Professor Popovski is Vice Dean at Jindal Global Law School and the Executive Director of Center for the Study of United Nations at OP Jindal Global University, India. Before coming to India, between 2004 and 14, Professor Popovski was Senior Academic Officer at the United Nations University in Tokyo, and after 2007, he served as head of its Peace and Governance Program. And our fourth panelist is Professor Ian Johnstone. Professor Johnstone is a professor of international law at Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, USA. From 2018 to 19, he served as Dean ad interim. Prior to joining Fletcher in 2000, Professor Johnstone served in United Nations Executive Office of the Secretary General and Department of Peacekeeping Operations. He continues to work as a consultant to the United Nations from time to time. I welcome and thank all the esteemed speakers for accepting our invitation to be a part of this panel. The theme of this session is Navigating the Labyrinth, the University in a World in Polycrisis. Now, a polycrisis describes the simultaneous and overlapping crisis facing the world currently. The world is facing polycrisis today, right from climate change, economic inequality, geopolitical tensions, and pandemic like COVID-19. These crises are interconnected and have a significant impact on the society. Historically, universities have often been considered to be a source of knowledge generation and innovation. When the world faces a challenge, universities are one institution that people look towards for finding a solution. Universities have risen to the occasion multiple times, be it by creating breakthrough vaccines, like the case of COVID-19, providing experts to lead world's most powerful economic institutions, like World Bank and International Monetary Fund, or helping build technologies of the future, like nuclear fission. Despite their track record, universities face a plethora of hurdles in creating and disseminating knowledge, even though it is one of the primary tasks and responsibility of universities. While finding solutions to complex problems faced by the world today requires freedom to challenge the existing perspectives of how the world works, any such action may also be looked at as a threat to the status quo. Thus, the powers that try to put pressure on individuals and institutions to not say the uncomfortable truth puts academic freedom under threat. Further, polycrisis that we face today cannot be solved without devoting financial resources. Yet, universities are facing funding cuts. In light of the current polycrisis, universities must adapt and evolve to meet the changing needs of the society. So the question is, what can university leaders do to move their institution in this direction? Are there strategies that have worked in one context from which others can learn? In this session, we will focus on these issues. And with that, I put forth my first question to the panel. Compared to 4 or 5 decades ago, has the role of the university in society changed? And does this institution still carry the same expectations as it did in the past? I request the panel to answer and share their thoughts. We can perhaps begin with Professor Borraccetti.
Okay, so thank you very much. First of all, let me say that it is a pleasure to be here with you. I'd say that this situation, just to answer to your question, universities are in a very different situation compared to 4 or 5 decades ago, because the world changed a lot of time in 4 or 5 decades. And first of all, not just for geopolitical situation, but also for the use of technology. Technology helped us in having this type, for example, conferences. So it is very high, the connection. But just to answer to the general question about university in the world of polycrisis, I'd say that I want to stress 3 parts, 3 little points in a very quick way. First of all, I think about the role of the universities. I think universities are a bridge among the culture, among people, among countries, and above all in a place where, in a moment in which in the world there is the multilateralism is under attack. I said that with this event, with other events, with our way to cooperate, we are showing how multilateralism is an added value and the importance to exchange. And this stresses the importance of our independence. Being independent means that even if the states, they have a different position, but universities are always a gate to speak to each other, even in the most difficult way, in the most difficult period. I'd say that it happens in the past. Think about what was happening in the past when there were wars around the world, but the university was still speaking and ready to cooperate, to think about the future. This is the second point, how we can think in the future. I think that we are in the best position because we don't have to manage the everyday life. We could contribute, but our task is also to think about the future. And this is the third point connected to our independence. I think that sometimes we should think about our independence, not just on our research or our thought, but also the condition of research, the fund, the connection with the world ranking, for example. And let me say the very last part, I'd like to explore more in detail this point. In this world, above all for European universities, because I'm working for a European university, but I think that is something global. We are in an ideal position, and our added value is also to engage with the social and civil society, with the community, and with the refugees or people that are forced to leave their country. This is the added value of our action.
Thank you, Professor Borraccetti, for highlighting and underlining the role that is played by the university historically and even today in meeting and combating the challenges faced by the world today. With that, I request Mr. Phil Baty to share his views.
Thank you very much indeed. So Times Higher Education has been surveying university leaders for several years now, and we've definitely noticed in the responses to the Times Higher Education Leadership Survey a new focus, a fresh focus on the social purpose of universities. I think university leaders are starting to see their mission to make the world a better place, their mission, their responsibility to society becoming more prominent, becoming more of an institutional priority, particularly with regards to the Sustainable Development Goals. And of course, we've had a situation where in very recent times, we've had a pandemic of almost unprecedented scale, or certainly unprecedented in modern times. We're seeing the climate crisis at an acute moment with real extreme effects of our weather, bushfires in Australia, flooding, unprecedented temperatures in the United Kingdom. We hit 40 degrees in the UK, which I know is common in lots of parts of the world. It's certainly not common in the UK. And of course, the geopolitical crisis, which has been brought home extraordinarily powerfully in Europe with the Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I think universities are seeing their roles as being to play an important part in trying to alleviate these crises. We certainly saw it in the pandemic. Universities responded admirably to the fight against the pandemic, not just through the science base, the research base, and the leadership role some universities took in developing treatments and vaccinations. We saw it in the social science. We saw that in America with the access to the data. We saw that in policy formation, the epidemiologists. We saw it through volunteering, through the health workers that universities provided. So extraordinary response there. And I think universities are seeing it as part of their mission. But also I'd say they're seeing the importance of a connection and universities, but also between parts of society and universities. And I think they see this as an opportunity to reconnect and re-establish their public good and their social role with communities.
Thank you, Mr. Baty, for emphasizing the social focus of the university and bringing into conversation the importance that universities play in meeting global challenges, goals of sustainable development, challenges that have been exacerbated further by the pandemic, but the need and the importance of university to reestablish mechanisms so that the world can face these challenges head on. With that, I request Professor Popovski to share his thoughts.
Thank you. We live in a polycrisis, and Marco and Phil already described that very well. And polycrisis did exist historically in the past. We can think of that disasters happen simultaneously most of the time. It's not only now. If we think of pandemics or world wars or economic crisis or natural disasters, they are always there. We can think of the First World War happening together with the largest Spanish flu. We can think of the triple disaster, for example, hitting Japan unexpectedly in March 2011, the biggest earthquake in the history of Japan, which then followed in the tsunami that hit the coastlines, killing almost 20,000 people, which also was combined with the damage to the nuclear reactors in Fukushima, which created fears of nuclear radiations. So crises are always, in a way, polycrisis. And for that matter, we are in but if the question is what has changed, let's say from 40, 50 or 100 years ago till now, is that we have the crisis of climate change, which comes with heavy negative effects, which hit heavily everybody in the world. We see how often and how intensive are the floodings, the fires, the extreme weather, the rising ocean level, the loss of biodiversity. which is a continuous negative effect from the climate change, which also combining with the COVID-19 pandemics and the rise of nationalism in many countries in the world, which also produced the conflict in Ukraine. All of those are really challenging times. And in addition to all of that, we have the complexity and dynamism of the technological advance, the globalization, the transparency, the mega data, the artificial intelligence. So on one hand, it's very challenging, but on the other hand, it's very interesting to be in a university those days and to see the global environment becoming local, because we are no longer distant. We are part of all of those. So excellent question, by the way, how to navigate the labyrinth. And it's a challenging time, as many of us think, how to get our students better prepared to go out and to face those challenges in their jobs and careers. As has been already said, the universities are there first and foremost to generate knowledge and to produce research. The Vice Chancellor mentioned this morning how the vaccinations were created by the universities. So the scientific discovery, the research, is a major part of the university. And the second task of the universities in those challenging times is to disseminate the knowledge, to teach and prepare students to mature and to move to their careers, and for them to figure out how to get out of the labyrinth of those challenges. So there are no easy ways, but exactly that put us in an important role to develop knowledge through research and also to disseminate knowledge through our research. One additional and final thing I'll say to this is that we have also the challenge of the fake news, the challenge of spreading misinformation, which also the university are the primary actors here to combat and to fight against. We saw that during the pandemics, how many people were in fact misinformed about the vaccinations. Not to say how many people, but including governments, are denying climate change and ignoring the need to take rapid action to that. So for us, it's very, very important and essential when we teach students to make them prepared to distinguish between the true science and also the fake news. I will stop at the moment and talk more when other questions come. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Popovski, for sharing your thoughts. Indeed, the world has always faced polycrisis in one form or the other, from world wars to nuclear disasters to natural calamities. And I agree with you when you say that universities must focus on preparing the students to face these challenges and to find solutions to these problems. With that, I move on to the next speaker. I request Professor Ian Johnstone to share his thoughts.
Thank you very much, Professor Nair, and thank you for inviting me to join this interesting conversation. I'd like to start with the notion, which I agree with fully, that the principal function of a university is to create and disseminate knowledge. But I think there's sort of two alternative, and I hope and imagine complementary perspectives on how to do that. And one of those really focuses on individuals, individual faculty, individual students. And the idea is that universities ought to enable these individuals to pursue their interests, their passions, their sense of what is valuable and important on their own, to give them free rein to explore that. And I think that's the spirit that underlies the notion of academic freedom. I think it's a spirit that underlies the notion of a curriculum which allows students to explore. And I think what drives it is the idea that there really is no all-seeing authority that can tell us what is important, what the causes and the consequences of a polycrisis, the polycrisis we're living in are. On the other hand, as Mr. Baty and others have suggested, and I absolutely agree with, universities serve a social purpose. They're highly influential, powerful social institutions. And that's what's driving this demand for relevance, to make sure that universities are conscious of the social impact they're having and working to ensure that social impact is constructive and not destructive. And I think that in this current polycrisis in which we're living, it's especially important. It's not all obvious what the causes and the consequences and how to manage this crisis are, and universities are ideally placed to think that through. And I don't think it requires some overarching authority to say you need to focus on this. This is the knowledge you need to pursue, but to allow those within the universities to exercise their critical faculties and their intellectual curiosity to explore precisely that, and to be thinking not only about knowledge for its own sake, but knowledge in terms of relating to and hopefully having a constructive impact on the outside world. So trying to sort of manage this relationship between giving individuals the free rein, the space to think and create, and then making sure that that's also harnessed towards some broader social purpose is the real challenge for the university today, and arguably more difficult than any time in the past.
Thank you, Professor Johnstone, for highlighting the importance of preserving individual freedom, but at the same time balancing it with the university's responsibility towards society and its need, and the need for it to be conscious of its social responsibility while addressing the polycrisis that the world is facing today. The next question that I have for the panel is to understand how universities should define the idea of polycrisis. The first step in solving a problem is accepting that there is a problem and then defining it clearly. So what role should universities play in developing an understanding of the polycrisis that the world faces today, and how can they play this role effectively? I would request Mr. Baty to share his thoughts.
Thank you. I think I would go back to Professor Johnstone's comments, actually. I think it is about ensuring an environment of academic freedom, of course, and also, as far as possible, institutional autonomy. I think universities have that role to be very much socially aware and have a social responsibility, but they also need to transcend politics, transcend geopolitics, transcend short-term thinking, but also, as far as possible, be at arm's length from government, so that they're able to speak truth to power. I think there's a need to really allow, and we'll talk about this later on in this session, I'm sure, multidisciplinary study to flourish, to in terms of undergraduate or the teaching environment, have a real multidisciplinary approach, a liberal arts approach, that actually students start to understand the world in a more complex way, outside silos, outside their narrow disciplines, and have a much more broad multidisciplinary approach. So those involved in STEM subjects have an understanding of the social sciences, have an understanding of the humanities. I think so many of the challenges we're facing require us to almost remind ourselves what it is to be human, you know, as we face a future workforce with huge amounts of automation, but with machine learning and artificial intelligence replacing lots of careers, creating huge economic change in the workplace, right through, of course, to the technical solutions for the climate crisis that will require both scientific discovery, but also a very clear focus on human behavior and societal behavior. So I think a multidisciplinary approach is vital on the teaching side. And again, you know, surveys that Times Higher Education has carried out, the students worldwide are increasingly demanding that they are given the skills to be what they describe as sustainable citizens, have a very sustainably minded mindset. So implementing an awareness of all the sustainable development goals, for example, into the curriculum. And I think there's a tendency to look at the sustainable development goals as environmental goals, the climate crisis, life underwater, life on land, but actually they are an extremely broad framework that include, of course, challenging poverty, providing food security, providing economic growth, decent work, gender in particular. So I think that's a really powerful framework to understand the cross-cutting, overlapping problems and crises that the world faces, including, geopolitics, SDG 16 is peace and justice, and strong institutions. So I would suggest that actually the SDGs provide an extraordinarily helpful framework for institutions, for students in the teaching environment, but also institutions at a leadership and strategic level to understand the world in a very nuanced and multidisciplinary way. And the fact that all of these things are crossing over each other and intersecting with each other is something that I think the SDGs help provide a really good framework for. So that would be my sense of articulating it. But the big thing for me really is that institutional autonomy and academic freedom. We need to have our scholars freed from worrying about being short-term political tools, being used and abused in a culture war, or being manipulated into only studying things that are politically expedient in the short term. And fundamentally, universities are there to speak truth to power. And that means speaking uncomfortable truths and being a thorn in the side of governments and being provocateurs, as well as providing the evidence base and providing the cool, calm, collected, evidence-driven approach to truth seeking. So that's probably a good place to pause and let others jump in.
Thank you, Mr. Baty, for establishing an idea where you're looking at the role universities can play in defining and addressing the polycrisis by connecting it to the Sustainable Development Goal and emphasizing on the importance of academic freedom and institutional autonomy to be able to, for university to attain it. With that, I move to, or rather request, Professor Borraccetti to share his views.
Well, I think that I can add a very few things to what my colleagues said before. And one is the developing of a critical thought that doesn't mean big again, but having it in mind as a model, the idea that we should be always curious, but also we should always to investigate, to understand reality. And sometimes reality is not really clear, is not always with just an answer, but also being critical means also that if there is a mainstream, to understand that the importance of our thought is to go ahead, even if we don't share the mainstream. From the other side, the curiosity means also that we should always think about the future. Sometimes we are more freeze in the current situation or in the past, but the added value is to think about the future. And I think this is the real, and it's the real challenge. And if you think what Professor Baty said about the importance of sustainable development goals, is exactly this point, because we are working on it, we are trying to work on it, but if you go outside, you understand that our task, and this is the answer to your question, our task is also to send a message to people outside of the university, outside of the researches, outside of the research project, that there are some needs that maybe they are not able to see, they don't want to see. So sometimes it's important to continue to stress it.
Thank you, Professor Borraccetti, for that thought. And further, I mean, what you shared here connects with also what Professor Popovski earlier referred to as the idea of misinformation, which is being spread, and the important role that universities can play in not only just speaking truth to power, but also bringing to light and particularly for people outside of the university as to what the reality is. Indeed, it is true that to be able to respond to reality, one needs to have an understanding of what reality is. It is absolutely critical to bring in any kind of change. All right, so with that, I move to Professor Popovski, and I request Professor Popovski to share his views on this question.
Thank you, Nisha. I very much agree with the framework which Phil and Marco just put in. Thinking about SDGs, an excellent framework. We see this very often, how universities preparing their curriculum actually ask faculty to indicate to what extent SDGs are part of their teaching, of their curriculum development. And it is an excellent framework for everybody. I would not say it just for the university. I just spoke to United Nations peacekeeping people, and they were saying that in their own, in many jobs, I will guess, SDGs create the necessary framework of thinking how we are socially responsible, how we are addressing the crisis as such. And somehow, to go back to the point of speaking truth to power, I agree that COVID-19 was a huge challenge, and many universities reacted more or less properly there. But I was thinking in terms of nationalism and armed conflict, how, for example, Russian universities today, facing the biggest challenge in their life of being in a position of an aggression against a peaceful neighbor, Ukraine, react. And I was in Russia, and I studied in the Moscow State Institute for International Affairs, and I was very happy to find that 1,400 faculty and students in my former university in Moscow signed a letter expressing their firm opposition to the war in Ukraine, which, again, speaking truth to power, probably is easy in India, probably is easy in the democratic world we are in United States and Europe. But definitely it's a big challenge for universities in situations such as Russia, China, and Belarus, North Korea, and other places where you cannot really, you risk, in other words, if you speak truth to power. But that also makes us thinking about the social responsibility and the need, how to prepare students in the future not to be scared to speak freely, and to not worry about the consequences of that. It's a hard question, but as we move forward, we hope that should be taken very seriously. And on the part of the research and the society, I think knowledge is very useful because it helps also people to develop skills. So polycrisis should be met with poly skills. And it comes back to the question of multidisciplinarity and how to prepare the skills our students need as to face those crises next when they move to their careers and jobs is an important and essential question. And how to prepare them also probably should inform us how to spend our priorities in terms of research. In other words, I will end up by saying that we don't need to define the global crisis as universal. They're already defined by the United Nations and the SDGs and all the think tanks. But what we should do is to prepare the students to have the poly skills as to move to their jobs and to address the poly crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Popovski. Indeed, there is a need for universities to reshape their curriculum to respond to the framework that is extended by the Sustainable Development Goals. The idea that polycrisis must be met by preparing students with poly skills indeed hits at the heart of this conversation. Thank you so much for bringing that thought to this conversation. With that, I request Professor Johnstone to share his views.
Thank you. I'll start with the Sustainable Development Goals and just add maybe a nuance or make explicit something that I think was implicit in what my co-panelists said, which is the role of the university isn't simply to promote the Sustainable Development Goals, but to engage in critical analysis of the Sustainable Development Goals. So, to understand where they come from, how they're being implemented, how well they're being implemented, what perhaps needs to be done differently. So again, the notion that it's not taking an agenda and viewing the university's job as advancing that agenda, but simply understanding the phenomenon from which perhaps recommendations and policy action would flow. A little more generally, in understanding the world and understanding the polycrisis or the polycrises, I'd start with the premise that universities are well placed to do this precisely because they have some distance. They're able to engage in objective analysis and scientific research and social scientific research. And I think that distance is valuable, but we also have to beware of the ivory tower syndrome, where academics and maybe students get too far removed from the real world. And I think there's a useful and not all that difficult way of addressing that concern, which is to ensure that faculty remain engaged in the policy world, in the professional world to an extent, not at the expense of doing research, not at the expense of compromising their academic freedom, but staying in touch with the world. And similarly, students to, as part of the curriculum, to engage in experiential learning, and to try to have some exposure to what's going on beyond the walls of the ivory tower. I come from an international law, social scientific background, so I'm thinking of it in those terms. But I do think that's important because it's tempting, if you're in the ivory tower, to imagine the crisis we're seeing now is not that different from many crises we've seen in the past. And the only way you can be sure of that is if you're out there actually feeling it and engaging with the people who are trying to work directly on it. So again, it's always a better balance here, balancing that distance with the need to stay engaged.
Thank you, Professor Johnstone, for that response. Indeed, the role of the university is not only to promote the SDG agendas, but also to critically view and identify what further needs to be done or what role it can play to respond to the social responsibilities that universities are uniquely placed to respond to. In fact, this idea of speaking truth to power has emerged quite a few times in this conversation. And Mr. Baty, initially in his response, spoke about the difficulties or the challenges that universities face and societies face because of political processes and situations such as war, which does place the role of the university and the students, and their ability rather to speak truth to the power. So with that, we move to the next question, because when we think about the society and particularly the politicians who are leading the political processes, they are often bound by their need to get re-elected, which may make them focus on short-term gains. There might be a lack of long-term strategic vision, especially in the context of developing nations or nations that are facing turmoils. As opposed to this, universities are institutions that are created with a vision to last for centuries. In what way can universities then, given these crises, take a driver's seat in shaping the discussions around the crucial challenges that the countries and the world face today? I would request Mr. Baty to share his views.
Thank you. It's difficult always coming after Ian, even on a fresh question, because I often refer back to his responses. I do think there's an extraordinary, delicate balancing act between the idea of sort of cloistering our students away. You think about the physical makeup of the University of Oxford or Cambridge, for example. It's literally cloistering students away from the world to have deep learning and deep thinking outside of society. But more and more and more, they need to work absolutely with a clear vision of what's going on out in the real world. I think in terms of protecting universities' ability to think long term, I do think one of the issues is about funding, actually. what we tend to see is the strings attached to funding of universities getting shorter and shorter. Governments sort of almost trying to control universities much more, require universities to bend to their political will a lot more, and that often is the mechanism of funding, as well as, you know, we have the mechanism of political pressure and political rhetoric. We're seeing that in the United States, for example, in Florida and parts of the world where lots of political pressure being borne down on universities about what they teach and how they teach, and you know, we want to try and ensure we protect institutional autonomy and protect academic freedom in those circumstances. You're seeing that all over the world. So I think funding autonomy is really important, because the biggest stick the biggest stick politicians have is often attaching things to the funding, and using funding to try and get what they want in terms of short-term gains. And there's an entirely legitimate concern for a taxpayer that they want to see their tax dollar invested wisely. They want to see a return on investment. They want to see, if we invest in a university with taxpayers' money, will we get that money back in terms of societal gain, as opposed to spending it in a hospital or spending it in a primary school or a secondary school. So I understand there's a legitimacy around accountability for funding, but I do worry about the increasing sort of regulatory burden, increasing burden attached to funding when it comes to governments. So I do think universities could be incredibly well placed to try and build as much financial autonomy as possible, become more entrepreneurial, find alternative sources of funding, become less dependent on the vagaries of short-term government thinking. Also transcending you know, changing government priorities. So that provides your fundamental basis of being able to continue to speak truth to power, to continue to have that autonomy. So I think that's very important. Another thing I'd add that I think is also really, really important, and obviously from my perspective, it's a personal passion, is universities must remain resolutely internationally connected. I believe all universities should have a global outlook. But I do think that means, again, to resist some of the pressures around geopolitics, to say, well, actually, we want to retain our academic connections across borders. We want to retain our relationships with academics across borders. And it's extremely difficult in the context, for example, of the Russia attack on Ukraine. Of course, there is a mood and a wish to isolate Russia as a state from this, but actually those individual human beings who are in these institutions, to Professor Popovski's point, a lot of individual Russian scholars are not necessarily supportive or advocating the national government's policies with regards to Ukraine. So how do we retain international collaboration, international friendship? I think that applies to the US and the West and China, for example. It applies to individual scholars in Russia. I think it applies to university. We need to try and ensure universities can transcend some of those specific international geopolitical challenges, so that we retain links, we retain an understanding of our common humanity, we retain a shared approach to the world's shared major problems. And that includes, you know, quite frankly, it includes promoting intercultural understanding and therefore promoting peace. Universities have a role, I think, in world peace, not to put it too simply.
Thank you, Mr. Baty, for underlining the importance of financial autonomy and how it is important for universities to become more entrepreneurial, so that they are not dependent on any powers or any government for funding, and at the same time remain interconnected internationally, irrespective of geopolitical reality, so that they can develop a shared approach and a shared understanding of how to face the challenges that the world is facing today. With that, I would request Professor Borraccetti to share his thoughts.
Well, I want to address two 3 points, or all are in connection with what Professor Baty said. When we said about the importance of independence or autonomy, or less of, let's say, I want to stress also the importance that university is not a company, in my view. is not a for-profit organization. The goal is another one. And in the last years, I'm honestly, I'm not against the ranking, but now we are using ranking as a competition, as obsessed to go to the best place, where without considering the fact that we are not for profit, but the fact that we cannot guarantee a final result if we want to be independent with our students. And at the same time, we are completely with the public funds controlled by bureaucracy, because our time is a lot of our time is for bureaucracy, for deliverable, for administration. I'm not saying that I don't want to do it, but at the same time, we are going to the opposite side. And this is very important because, again, I think that it should stress that for the university is much more important comparison than competition. And I agree on what Professor Baty said about the importance of internationalization. And there are several examples, as I was said before. At the same time, I think that we should also stress that two other points. One, to the student. University doesn't mean that we are teaching something for them to find exactly their job, but it is a matter of the mind. So we give them the chance, more opportunities to find a job worldwide. This is the first point. And the second point towards the role, we could be political actor, but we are not politicians. That is different. Meaning that we can stress the importance, we can stress the analysis, we can show, but we should stay away from the political competition, because if not, we are at risk of losing our independence. And in some countries, this could be very risky situations. Let's say I will not repeat what my colleague said before about the some part of the world, because I totally agree. So
thank you, Professor Borraccetti, for sharing your thoughts on this matter. I mean, the idea that a university should not become site of politics is definitely important for it to constructively contribute to shaping the society and fulfill its social responsibility. With that, I would request Professor Popovski to share his thoughts on the question.
Thank you, Nisha, for this excellent question. Indeed, the short-termism of politicians, but actually not only of politicians, let me say corporations are often short-term as well. They have to report every quarter their profits to the shareholders. And politicians have to be elected every 4 or 5 years in those countries where there are democratic elections. And we see how quickly they realize how wrong they were when they make mistakes, like when the politicians in United Kingdom promoted the Brexit, and soon after the Brexit they realized, and not only they, but the people of United Kingdom realized that decision to leave the European Union actually didn't bring any benefit for most of them. Similarly in Brazil, when you have a climate denier like former now President Bolsonaro, and how quickly, after several fires and floodings, people realize that actually denying climate change is the wrong policy. And here comes the crucial difference, and our Vice Chancellor Siraj Kumar mentioned this in the morning. Actually, two of the challenges he mentioned are very relevant here. One is this national-international. If the universities stay national and think only about their own local agenda, that over time will produce the problem of being outside the global world, outside the global knowledge, outside the global challenges and how other countries face those challenges. But also the importance to inspire students long term. And here comes, I will add to that another challenge. Of course, we are also acting as corporations. We need to report annually how the budget is spent, specifically research budget. But often the result of our work comes very long-term instead of very short-term, because students taking the knowledge after 5-year degree, they move to their career. Some of them become global citizens and leaders. Somehow the result of the university will be seen over time, not immediately, not every quarter and not every year. So it's really a challenge to produce outcomes which are long-term, and we are exactly the institutions that should work long-term rather than short-term, in contrast to corporations and governments. And here comes, how do we evaluate? Actually, a good question to Phil and to other who assess the rankings and the scoring and how universities work. We need to take a longer term perspective. The time factor here is crucial. Somebody may not produce much over 5 years, but then suddenly a book or an article might become global. This famous artist, Amedeo Modigliani, who nobody knew when he was alive. He unfortunately died, but then his sister sold his art and he became globally famous after, unfortunately, he already passed away. So sometimes the results and the outcomes come later, but they need also to be taken account. That's exactly why universities are different from corporations and government. Thank you for this excellent question.
Thank you, Professor Popovski, for stressing on the need for universities to work with the long-term vision, irrespective of what the political position might be on the matter, and also highlighting the fact that sooner or later, the world has to recognize the polycrisis that it is facing. Denial is not the way to proceed, and that university must continue to work with the long-term vision so as to meet the challenges that the world is facing at present and will continue to in future. With that, I would request Professor Johnstone to share his views.
Thank you. I'm glad that Professor Popovski sort of introduced the corporate influence in addition to governmental, because I come from two jurisdictions. One is Canada and the other is United States, and I've worked in universities in both. And I suppose Canada's model with respect to funding is somewhere between the US approach and the European or perhaps the Indian approach, which is that in the United States, government does not provide that much funding, certainly not to the private universities and even the public universities. And so revenue has to be generated in other ways, often relying on student tuition. But of course, the cost of higher education is going through the roof in the United States. And, if anything, that has to come down rather than continue to go up. So that's not a really sustainable funding model to keep charging students more and more. And if the government's not going to step up, it means turning to philanthropies and turning to corporations, perhaps. And the risk there, of course, with corporations is that their fundamental interest is the bottom line and not necessarily the social or even educational purpose that the university serves. Certainly not automatically that. And philanthropies are big sources of funding in American universities, but primarily for research projects and not core funding to basically keep the lights on in the building. And so, if anything, I think protecting the financial autonomy of the institutions in the United States and arguably Canada requires more and not less government funding. But that, of course, then raises all of the problems that my co-panelists have already raised, which is, well, if you're subject to the vicissitudes of government funding, that's also concerning. So I think all I'm really doing here is adding to the complexity of managing the funding issue, bearing in mind that the sources of funding range from governments to students to student parents, by the way, to corporations, to philanthropies. And I think it's ultimately has to be some mix of those. But I lean towards the view as a Canadian that the United States is just too far on the spectrum of relying on private sources of funding. I don't think that's sustainable.
Absolutely, Professor Johnstone. I completely agree with you there. Philanthropic initiatives are definitely important for university to develop a sustainable model to continue to fund its initiatives, research, and all the activities that it is required to fulfill as an important stakeholder in the society. With that, I think it is time to engage with some questions from the audience. We have received a number of questions. We will try to take a few of them as the time permits. Ash Malik has a question here. He asks, what is the role of universities in developing ethics and value systems to navigate Web 3.0 and the world of generative AI? I would request the panel to address this question. I'll
happily jump in very briefly before others. I think from my perspective, it goes back to some of the comments we made earlier around interdisciplinarity. I'm a massive advocate of protecting the arts and humanities. I think there is potentially a risk to say that if the future is digital, if our entire world will be driven by artificial intelligence and technology, that we need lots and lots of people who are wonderful technologists and wonderful STEM researchers. And of course, we do need that. But I also think it really hammers home the necessity of having philosophers and historians and literature students. So we constantly have people able to bring it back to, you know, the human implications of technology that does literally question what it is to be human. So I actually think that while there seems to be a trend away from the arts and humanities, a trend to defund the arts and humanities, or for universities to reduce their provision, for governments to question the value of these subjects as being rather luxurious, I do think it hammers home the need for arts and humanities education alongside, because we absolutely will be fundamentally questioning how society works in a very, very different world. So it really goes back to me towards a liberal arts style education, a cross-disciplinary education, and protecting a very broad range of subjects. So just a small point there. I'm not saying we should be determining the ethics and imposing ethics, but we should certainly have we are the places as universities to ensure ethical considerations are absolutely front and center of considerations when we think about the future of an AI-driven world.
Thank you, Mr. Baty, for that response. We have one more question from the audience. A clear responsibility of the university is to train students who are going to work in a world faced with polycrisis. Upon graduation, students will lead the effort to solve the challenges that the world is facing. So are we training them, or are the universities training them well enough to operate in this complex world? What are the areas where universities need to significantly improve in this context? I request the panel to volunteer and respond.
Can I say a few words?
Yes, please.
Very, very fast. Then, as you know, Professor, I will leave because you know that I have my means of transport waiting for me. But I want to say that this is the most important challenge for us. But as I was saying before, from one side, the challenge is to look at the future for us. So to imagine, according to our researches, according to what is going on. But it is very important for the students to understand that a bachelor or a graduation doesn't necessarily match with the job or with the job they have in mind. The added value of the university is for sure having a good educational background, but it's also the importance of a good education to have the being available to adapt, to think, to face, and to imagine. This is the added value of the university. And I apologize, but I must go, and I thank you, all of you, and the audience.